South Africa is home to one of the most unequal societies in the world. There are a multitude of reasons and causes for this, including decades of corruption and maladministration from the current ruling party, the ANC. With that being said, it is important for us to understand how it became one of the most unequal societies in the first place. Because it didn't happen overnight. In fact, the root cause of this problem stretches as far back as the arrival of the Dutch East India Company in 1652. However, the role played by apartheid in this phenomenon cannot be stressed enough. A lot has been said about apartheid. In particular, the brazen racism and primitive brutality that was displayed during its era. But beyond the well-documented violence of apartheid, what is apartheid? Apartheid was not designed by racist Boers in khaki shorts on a farm somewhere in the middle of nowhere. It was designed by highly educated Afrikaner intellectuals with a clear and tangible goal in mind. So for what purpose was apartheid designed? And who really benefited from apartheid? Well, for us to understand apartheid, we have to first understand Afrikaner nationalism. The term nationalism refers to an ideology or premise that the collective aspirations of a nation far exceed one's own individual interests, dreams, and ambitions. Afrikaner nationalism was and is largely an ethnic nationalism, which is heavily focused on race and racial supremacy, with an aim to uphold and preserve Afrikaner history, language, and culture. And most of the time, ethnic nationalism goes a step further by propagating a sense of superiority that suggests that their race is or should be far more superior than other races or ethnic groups, as well as emasculating and demonizing any other ethnic group that they feel will threaten their purity and prosperity. And there lies the danger of nationalism, both to those who promote it, but more especially those who feel the brunt of it. Nationalism can only be fostered and maintained if two conditions are met. Firstly, those promoting nationalism have to somehow establish themselves as the victims of whatever atrocities, fake or real. Secondly, there has to be a real, tangible enemy that they can pin all their shortcomings and struggles on. In the perspective of the Afrikaner nationalists at that time, they were the victims of being a minority ethnic group surrounded by a massive African native population. They had also been ravaged by the British Empire. Thus, they had two enemies: the British Empire, who had defeated them and left them on the brink of poverty, and the massive black population, which threatened their survival by the sheer size of their population alone. So we go all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century. During the Anglo-Boer War, the Afrikaners suffered heavy losses both economically and socially. They had very little power as compared to their British counterparts, who had at the time a colonial empire stretching nearly the entire planet. Afrikaner people at the time didn't even own any commercial banks or major enterprise. They were really a motley crew in comparison to the British Empire at the time. In fact, most Afrikaners were battling to make ends meet. Couple that with the fact that they were a minority group nowhere near the sheer size and scale of the black indigenous population. They lacked the economic and financial muscle of the British. There was thus a collective existential anxiety amongst the Afrikaners in regards to their future. A spirit of Afrikaner nationalism began to take roots amongst the Afrikaners. And through that spirit of Afrikaner nationalism, a secret organization was born in 1918. The organization was the Afrikaner Broederbond, or League of Brothers. This organization was tasked with the responsibility of steering the wheels of the future of Afrikaner people through acquiring economic and later political power that would allow their people to root out poverty from their midst, as well as preserve their culture and foster a spirit of Afrikaner nationalism throughout the entire Afrikaner population. Thus, through this secret organization, the League of Brothers, the seeds of apartheid had been planted. As the Afrikaner Broederbond grew in membership and influence, so did the financial capital they had in their hand. They then used that capital to establish a number of small entities, which would later grow into larger entities, most of which are major JSE listed entities today. One of the first companies they established was Sanlam, the insurance company, and Santam, the trust fund company. And later on, the Afrikaner Bank, which would later be known as Absa Bank, because of the need for them to have their own bank. They also founded their first media company around that time, Naspers, with the simple task of spreading the propaganda of Afrikaner nationalism amongst the Afrikaner population. Up until this point, the philosophy of Afrikaner nationalism was largely popular in the area of Stellenbosch, where unironically, Verwoerd, a man who would later become the Prime Minister of South Africa, was a Stellenbosch University graduate and professor who began formulating the theory of apartheid around 1934 with other Afrikaner intellectuals. He would later help usher in one of the most violent and oppressive periods in the history of South Africa. Through the implementation of apartheid in 1948. The National Party, a nationalist party with heavy influence from the Afrikaner Broederbond, won the elections and took control of the union buildings. Not long after that, apartheid was introduced. Verwoerd was already a policymaker at that time and had his hands on a lot of legislative laws that were passed in order to further the agenda of apartheid at that time. Well, what was the agenda of apartheid? Apartheid was implemented by the National Party, who owed their allegiance to the Broederbond. The Broederbond was established in the little-known town called Stellenbosch, as we have already established, with the purpose of safeguarding and preserving the history and culture of Afrikaner people. as well as to elevate the Afrikaners into the dominant group socially, economically, and politically. Through the spirit of Afrikaner nationalism. Afrikaner people knew that they were a minority in the country compared to the Africans, Indians, coloreds in the country. They had no idea how long they would last in power. With that in mind, they wanted to implement apartheid rapidly and in a manner so robust that if they were removed from power at any moment, it would be very difficult to reverse the impact of apartheid. And we cannot ignore the large influence of the Nazi Germany, who were nationalists themselves, in the formulation and implementation of apartheid policies. The Nazis were infamous for being very quick and robust in the implementation of their plans. This is even evident in the way in which they chose to wage war during World War II. So with the National Party operating with the mindset that they had very little time to implement their plans, they passed a few legislative laws that would go on to cause such deep socio-economic issues, particularly to black South Africans, that the effects would be felt decades after the fall of apartheid. Some of the key policies that were implemented almost immediately after the National Party came to power were 1949's Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act, which made marriages between whites and members of other racial groups illegal. 1950's Population Registration Act, the 1950's Group Areas Act, and later the Bantu's Authorities Act, which was essentially the physical separation of the population by racial identification, giving the government the authority to place groups in areas the government deemed fit enough for that particular group. Thus, the creation of the Bantustans and the Black Townships. The ultimate objective of this act was to push Africans into the outskirts of the country. This was usually the villages and remote areas. Basically, places that had very little to no resources. The idea was to eventually give those resourceless Bantustans independence, and thus end up with a South Africa that had only white citizens. 1952's Native Laws Amendment Act was established to exert more control over the black population. These acts were implemented to further the unequal allocation of resources in South Africa. The 1953's The Reservation of Separate Amenities Act was established, which stated that all races would have their own separate facilities. And of course, the white facilities were of a higher quality than the other races. Under the provisions of this act, apartheid signs were erected throughout South Africa. Naturally, these laws and legislations were met with heavy resistance, particularly from the non-white population, who saw these laws and legislations for what they were: tools of oppression. However, there was one legislation that was far more devastating than the legislations mentioned prior. The Bantu Education Act in 1953, which redirected the education of the black population away from the Ministry of Education to the Ministry of Native Affairs. The intention was for Africans to receive an inferior education that would ultimately make them docile and more receptive to the current and future laws of apartheid. The success of apartheid heavily depended on the submission of the overwhelming majority of the population, the Africans. So Bantu education was designed to further entrench a collective feeling of inferiority amongst the African natives. However, even though apartheid was successfully legislated and then rolled out, it faced resistance at every turn. Around the same time, there was a large boom of black intellectuals and leaders who fearlessly challenged the apartheid government and continued to influence the African masses. Prior to the introduction of apartheid, many of the resistance movements chose the method of peaceful resistance and negotiations as their strategy of engaging with the oppressive regime. But after the introduction of apartheid, there was a small cluster of young black, colored and Indian intellectuals who were growing disgruntled with the non-violent form of resistance and were itching to take up arms to fight for their rights and dignity. The likes of Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, Robert Sobukwe, Chris Hani and Steve Biko emerged in order to challenge the monster which was apartheid. Be that as it may, the oppressive legislations that the National Party implemented gave Afrikaner nationalists enough time to keep the rest of South Africa at bay, while they continued to hoard the national resources and channel them to their own population and institutions, all the while eliminating and detaining any individual or organization that spoke out against apartheid. This was made easy by the Suppression of Communism Act, which on paper was designed to outlaw any organization that promoted communism. But in actual fact, it was used to target any organization that posed a threat to the apartheid government, both literally and ideologically. However, despite all these laws and the violent brutality at the hands of the apartheid government, the resistance to apartheid never stopped. In fact, it intensified. Then, in the late 1950s, Verwoerd, the Prime Minister and Chief Architect of Apartheid, was assassinated in Parliament. Before his departure, Verwoerd went on a tireless crusade, particularly in the Bantustans or homelands, trying to convince Africans and indeed the world that the ultimate goal of apartheid was not segregation or racial discrimination, but rather separate development. I'm paraphrasing here, but in Verwoerd's own words, every race would have their own infrastructure, as well as their own lands and facilities, basically the freedom to fashion their own destiny. Very few Africans were convinced. In 1976, the government proclaimed the Transkei an independent nation-state and followed this move by granting independence to Bophuthatswana in 1977, Venda in 1979, and Ciskei in 1981. Another 6 ethnically based homelands were granted limited self-governance in the 1980s in preparation for eventual independence. They were KwaZulu, Leboa, Kesankulu, Kwakwa, Kangwane, and KwaNdebele. With this Verwoerd-inspired method, the government not only tried to dispel the appearance of political repression of its own citizens, but also cut financial costs associated with what it considered an unproductive segment of the population. Fewer hospitals, schools, electricity lines, water supplies, and so forth were built or maintained in these homelands. The black intellectuals of the time could easily interpret these Verwoerd-inspired methods. Nevertheless, despite the protests and backlash against apartheid, the Afrikaner nationalist machinery continued to churn out profit after profit through their numerous institutions. With the help of cheap black labor as well, of course, which was also a great attraction to foreign investments. The apartheid-led government saw a boom in terms of the economic growth, despite the discrimination happening in the country. In the early 1970s, the first products of the Bantu education were produced. However, they were not as obedient and docile as the apartheid masterminds had anticipated. And with black intellectuals and philosophers such as Biko springing up, the apartheid government decided to intensify the Bantu education by implementing a previously ignored section of the legislation which stated that all subjects should be taught through the medium of Afrikaans. The African youth of the time violently opposed this move. This ushered in one of the bloodiest periods of South African history since the Anglo-Boer War. It began with the Soweto uprising in 1976 when scores of African children died at the hands of the apartheid government when they protested against being taught in Afrikaans, which was viewed as the language of the oppressor. The events of the Soweto uprising was a step too far by the apartheid government. The apartheid government began losing faith in their Bantu education policy, being able to successfully convert the African populace into docile people who willingly accepted apartheid. So they resorted to intimidation and brutal force, culminating in the death of one of the most celebrated black leaders in 1977, Steve Biko, in police detention. The apartheid government, however, had underestimated Biko's influence and popularity not only in South Africa but the world over. Therefore, Steve Biko's death sparked outrage in the world community, later resulting in worldwide condemnation and economic sanctions as well against the apartheid government. It was now clear to all Afrikaner nationalists, except perhaps the most conservative Afrikaners, that the policy of apartheid was crumbling and fast. Therefore, it was necessary to delay the inevitable destruction of apartheid as much as possible, amass as much economic power as they could, all the while preparing for the inevitability of a black-led government. So when we objectively analyze the mindset and philosophy of the architects of apartheid, it is clear to see that the system of apartheid wasn't a system merely driven by blind hatred for black people. Apartheid was a system created with the intention of using political power to strengthen the Afrikaners at the expense of other groups, Native Africans in particular. It's not a coincidence that apartheid was formulated in an era heavily dominated by nationalists like Hitler and Mussolini. Two infamous nationalists who started a bloody world war that cost millions of lives. In South Africa, Afrikaner nationalism helped elevate Afrikaner culture to new heights at the expense of other racial groups, particularly the black population. Unfortunately, unlike the Nuremberg trials, which managed to bring some form of justice to those who were trampled on by Hitler's Nazi Germany, those who were trampled on by the apartheid machinery have been forced to simply move on, with no justice or means of reparations. And the psychological effects of apartheid on black people are not likely to be successfully reversed for a very long time, probably not in our lifetime. Be that as it may, one has no choice but to take note of how the Afrikaner people went from abject poverty to being one of the most powerful racial groups not only in Africa but the world over. With that being said, I would like to say thank you to everyone who managed to make it this far. You really are appreciated. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe. More content on the way. My name is Freedom. Till next time, cheers.